is my hero, Senator Tom Harkin. There he is. Dear Senator, participants in this truly important summit, my sisters and my brothers all, good morning. Good morning. Now, someone once said to feel gratitude and not to express it is like wrapping a gift, putting a great big red bow on it, and never giving it. So, because I feel so much gratitude for the privilege of being here this morning, I want to express it. Now you will notice that I greeted each of you as my sisters and my brothers all. As far as I know, I'm not related to any of you. So why am I using this language? I'm using it because of what I learned when I was trained as an anthropologist. Namely, that kinship is not so much about biology as it is about shared values. It's about people behaving in a certain way towards each other. It's about folk going through challenges and experiencing triumphs. It's about folk bonding together in the hope that one day their dreams will be a reality. So you're my sisters and my brothers all, because we all value equity, accessibility, diversity, and inclusion. I'm in the same struggle that each of you is in. It is ultimately a struggle for social justice. And yes, with each of you, I dream of the day when our differences won't make any more difference. Now, what could I possibly say this morning that might be useful? Well, I've got enough sense to know that when you don't know something, you seek good counsel. So I went to my sister friend of many, many years, Deb Daggett. And as she and her hubby Dan and my hubby JD and I shared a dinner, I said, all right, hit me with it. What am I supposed to do? You got me into this. And Deb, with her usual good counsel, said, why don't you just tell your story? Tell your story of being an ally to people with disabilities. So that's what you're going to get. You're going to get my story. If it is effective, give me lots of credit. If it's a bummer, there's Deb Daggett. But in telling my story, I do so with full understanding that our stories connect. Our stories are related to each other. And we can learn from our stories, or we can simply affirm what we already know. I grew up in the horrific days of legal segregation, racial discrimination, as a legalized set of actions in my country. I grew up in Jacksonville, Florida. But while there was this narrative the dominant narrative that said no matter what I did, no matter how much education I got, I would never be as good as a white person. But aha, there was a counter narrative that my parents, my great-grandfather, my grandfather, everybody in my family, all the folk in my black community said, and there were a few righteous folk who said it as well, that that was nonsense. And that one of the ways that I would move forward would be through education and, of course, good old hard work. That's the narrative, the counter-narrative that I heard, that my oldest sister, Marvine Betch, heard, that my 9 years younger brother, John Thomas Betch Jr. heard. And now I want to stop to tell you a little bit about my sister. She listened to the counter-narrative and went on to get an incredible education and to work really hard. She went to Oberlin College's conservatory, where she was a double major in voice and piano. My sister went on to become an opera singer, and she sang lead roles in German state opera in impeccable German. Back in those days, because our sensibilities and our knowledge was not as it is today, I cannot explain to you exactly what happened to my sister in Germany. But I do know that when she returned to our home, the language that was used in those days was, she sort of had an emotional breakdown. Whatever that means, what I can tell you is that was my first experience in being an ally to someone with a disability. My sister's mental condition did not make me love her any less. To be truthful, it probably made me love her even more. What I can tell you is this, and this is the lesson I want to draw from it. When my sister returned to Florida, she started living on a beach. It's called American Beach. It's on Amelia Island, 40 miles north of Jacksonville. And while she did not have a regular job, a job, she had work that was so meaningful. My sister, not single-handedly, but with others, literally saved that beach that had been founded by our great-grandfather. By the way, our great-grandfather's name was Abraham Lincoln Lewis. My sister became an extraordinary environmentalist. In fact, she is the one who got that beach on the National Historic Registry. It was my sister who did so much in the environmental movement. I want you to know there's a right whale named after her. And so the point I want to draw from that chapter in my story is that work is so fundamental to everyone. Not only as a means for us to feed ourselves, but as a means to feed our dignity. I followed my family's instructions as well. Got as much education as I could, worked hard, became something that I could hardly pronounce when I went to Oberlin College, I became an anthropologist. And I also focused on African studies. Connecting to Africa in both an intellectual and an emotional way has been incredibly important in my life. And so it will not surprise you to hear that I do have a particular interest in communities of disabled people on that continent. Now, some might say, oh, come on, why don't you just, if you want to be an ally for disabled folk in your own country? Huh. You think Africa doesn't belong to me? And guess what? There isn't a single human being who isn't an African. Go back far enough into prehistory, where do you think we all came from? And I'm very fond of saying the sooner white folk admit they're Africans, the better the world is going to be. So, what can I tell you about disabled communities? Probably something you already know. That on that continent, somewhere between 60 and 80 million people are disabled. Disabled from conditions that began at birth, that are the result of malnutrition, disease, environmental stuff that should not happen, accidents, and then, of course, conflict and war. Disabled people are estimated to be somewhere around 10% of the population of that great continent. Could be as high as 20% when we look at the poorest parts of that continent. While I may not know if it's 10% or 20%, this I do know, that whatever challenges are suffered by people without physical and cognitive disabilities are incredibly intensified in a country with such poverty. That means that the majority of African people with disabilities are excluded from schools and opportunities to work, and are there set up to lead a life of being the poorest of the poor. I have to just share with you these words from Dr. Martin Luther King, because they really say, even better than I can say, why it is that I have to care about disability on the continent of Africa among people, why I have to care about what's going on for folk in LGBTQ communities, why I have to care about the struggle of Latinx, a new way not to have to go through Latino and Latina, the struggle of First Nation people, or perhaps you prefer to say American Indians, the struggle of Asian Americans, the struggle of the poor, the struggle of folk being discriminated against because of no reason other than that they are of the Jewish or of the Islamic or of the Hindu or some other faith. These were Dr. King's words, written in the Birmingham jail. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects, whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Well, I went on to become a college professor and a college president. It was when I was appointed to the presidency of Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, and became the first African-American woman to be the president of a historically black college for African-American women. Don't ask me how you explain that. I think the explanation is sexism. But it was during that time when I was a first that I met and developed an incredibly close relationship with another first. King Jordan, the first deaf president of Gallaudet University. What can I say about Brother President? He and I were in this really strange position of being first, but that's okay, because we were committed to the fact that you can be a first, but you got to work to make sure there's a second, a third, a fifth, and a 100th. It was while I was getting to know King Jordan that I accepted his invitation to join the board of trustees of Gallaudet University. And as many of you know, Gallaudet is right here in Washington, D.C. It is the only liberal arts higher education institution for people who are deaf and hard of hearing. I want to tell you about a little incident. It was during the period when the debate was going on about the cochlear implant. So I, a hearing person, said to one of my colleagues, "Oh, this is wonderful. Just imagine every deaf person who is, ready for such a process and whose condition will allow it can now become hearing and not experience the oppression, the discrimination that so often comes from being deaf." Do you know what that colleague said to me? That colleague said, "So are you working on the day when you'll no longer be black and you can just turn white and then you won't have to experience discrimination from being black?" Now, regardless of what your position is on the cochlear implant, all right, whether you think it's a good idea or not, the lesson we have to learn from that experience that I had is to, in quotes, listen. Listen to people who are in that community. Why do we assume, not being in the center of a community, that we know what is best for them? I want to also now tell you about another experience, and with another dear friend. King is a dear brother friend. I want to tell you about a sister friend. I joined the board of one of the great corporations of our country. It is Merck Pharmaceutical. Well, on a particular day, somebody was introduced as coming. She was a new, said they, Chief Diversity Officer by the name of Deb Daggett. So like other board members, I sat waiting for Deb Daggett to appear. I sat with all of the straight white guys, the straight white women who were on that board and who were members of the management team. And she walked in, and I, as you can see, a tall black woman, connected with a white woman who is a little person. The connection was almost overpowering. And while we didn't really have to say a lot, we were speaking through our intersectionalities. We were speaking through our multiple identities. We were connecting across difference. And if there is one lesson to be learned from that, it is surely that we need to be aware of our multiple identities. We need to be aware that we cannot be simply or only defined as disabled. When anyone who is disabled is so much more than that. Yes, you can define me as black or even as a black woman, but I am that more and a bag of chips. When we acknowledge our multiple identities, we acknowledge our ability. It's not a good one, watch it. Our ability to be a victimizer. To be victimized on the basis of one identity and turn around and victimize somebody else on the basis of another. Well, I need to bring closure now on my story. Timekeeper tells me so. And I want to do so by telling you a story. It's a story that Fannie Lou Hamer, the great civil rights leader, drum major for justice, would tell at the end of a story. When she wanted to say to those who had been listening, now who's going to do the work? And if there's one thing this gathering is about, it is about responding to the call that Senator Harkin has put out for what we are to do now 20 years after ADA. The last line of the story will tell you who is to do the work so that all in the communities of disabled people will have their full rights, so that all of us will have our full rights. Here's the story. It's a story about a few boys who played hooky from school one day. And then they proceeded to find a way to get into trouble. So the ringleader found a bird and started, frankly, to torture that bird. But they got bored with that, so they decided to go do something else. Said the ringleader, let's go up the road a piece to where that old lady lives. I'm going to ask her a question she is incapable of answering. The last line of this story, what the old lady says, that's who's going to do the work the brother senator has called us here to do. So the ringleader said, yo, old lady, you see this bird? I'm going to put it behind my back. And I'm going to ask you a question. So, old lady, the bird behind my back, is it dead or is it alive? Now, he had already worked it out with his buddies that if she said the bird was dead, he was going to release his hand. The bird would fly away. But if to the question, is the bird dead or alive, if she said the bird is alive, he was going to crush it. So he poses the question, old lady, this bird behind my back, is it dead or is it alive? The old lady took her own sweet time. But eventually she decided she would answer. And the old lady said, the bird behind your back? Why, it's in your hands. That's the answer. Being fully engaged in this struggle for the more than deserved rights of all people with disabilities. Continuing in this struggle for the rights of all of us. Why, it's in your hands and it's in mine. Thank you so much.